At just 13 years old, Bill Gates was already sneaking out of his childhood home in Seattle late at night. Why? Not to meet friends, not to play pranks, but to code. He would ride a city bus across town in the dark in search of a teletype terminal in an old computer lab. This wasn't a pastime. It was a calling. Back then, computers were massive, expensive, and mysterious. Very few people understood them, but young Bill was drawn in. At Lakeside School, a teletype machine connected to a remote General Electric mainframe became his secret laboratory. He taught himself BASIC. He wrote games, even a tic-tac-toe program, and he watched in awe as the machine executed every single command perfectly. Yet despite his genius, he was still a teenager, misunderstood, restless, craving more time at the terminal than he was allowed. When the computer company that hosted their terminal discovered his group exploiting bugs to earn more access, Gates and his friends were banned. But being banned didn't stop him. Instead of walking away, Gates made a deal. He offered to find the company's bugs in exchange for more time to code. How did a 13-year-old kid, obsessed with a machine most adults didn't even understand, end up building a company that would one day dominate the world? But what happened next changed everything. By the mid-1980s, the name Bill Gates was beginning to echo far beyond the quiet suburbs of Seattle where he grew up. Before he reached his early 30s, he would become one of the youngest self-made billionaires in history. Yet the path that carried him there didn't begin with wealth, privilege, or a clear roadmap. But he did have something far more powerful, a mind that refused to switch off. By the age of 31, Gates would become one of the youngest self-made billionaires in American history. But the road leading there wasn't built on money. It was built on obsession. Long nights inside computer labs, risks taken before anyone understood their value, and decisions that would push an entire industry forward, sometimes faster than the world was ready for. He wasn't born into a tech household. There were no computers in his living room. Nothing hinted that the quiet boy reading for hours on the floor would someday reshape global technology. But those early years mattered, because the world he grew up in was nothing like the one he would later rebuild. As Microsoft took shape in the mid-1970s, it wasn't just another startup. It was a storm gathering momentum faster than even Gates could track. One product, one deal, one insight at a time, and suddenly the company wasn't chasing the future. It was defining it. The world was changing. Technology was no longer distant. It was becoming personal. By the time Microsoft went public in 1986, the company was valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, and the young programmer who once snuck into computer labs at night had become a global figure, admired, questioned, and watched by an entire industry. But the rise itself isn't the whole story. Behind every milestone from these early years lies a deeper pattern. Choices Gates made long before the world knew his name. And those choices reveal how one teenager managed to position himself at the center of a revolution no one else saw coming. Because in the beginning, he was simply Bill, a curious child from Seattle who couldn't stop chasing ideas. The conflict, early challenges before the world saw Bill Gates as a brilliant founder. Before Microsoft, before the billion-dollar headlines. There was a boy who struggled to fit into the world around him. At Lakeside School, Bill was intelligent, almost overwhelmingly so, but his mind rarely aligned with the pace of his classroom. Teachers saw potential, yes, but also disruption. He questioned everything, pushed boundaries constantly, and grew frustrated with slow lessons. His curiosity was sharper than his discipline, sharper than any structure school could impose. And then everything changed the moment Lakeside brought in a teletype computer terminal. While the machine intimidated most students, Bill felt something different. A pull, a sense of clarity he hadn't found anywhere else. Every keystroke brought order. Every command made sense. Every problem could be solved logically. For a kid who often felt out of place, the computer offered something he rarely experienced: control. But access to the terminal came with a cost. It was expensive. Time limits were strict. Students were expected to share it. Yet Bill and a small circle of friends wanted more. Much more. They discovered ways to extend their limited computer time by finding flaws in the system's tracking. They weren't trying to break rules. They were trying to break limits, to push themselves deeper into the world that felt like home. But when the computer company noticed irregular activity, everything came crashing down. Bill, Paul Allen, and their friends were suddenly banned from the computer they treasured. For someone like Bill, coding wasn't just a hobby, it was the only place where his mind felt aligned. Losing access meant losing the one thing that made sense. He had two choices: walk away or find another path back in. He chose the second. Rather than hide from what happened, he faced the company directly. He and his friends offered something unusual for teenagers: to help them find errors in their software, in exchange for computer time. The company agreed. Gates had turned a punishment into an opportunity. Still, life outside the computer lab wasn't simple. His parents encouraged him to explore different interests, from academics to outdoor activities. They worried he spent too much time in front of screens, too much time thinking instead of socializing. Bill struggled to balance who he was expected to be with who he felt he truly was. And beneath all of this, the late-night coding, the quiet rebellion, the academic friction, was a deeper challenge. No one around him could see where all this would lead. Not yet. But he kept coding, kept learning, kept pushing, because something in him knew the world was changing, and he wanted to be at the front of that change. Then came the moment that shifted everything once again. A moment that would take Bill and his closest friend straight into the heart of the emerging computer revolution. The first breakthrough. By the early 1970s, Bill Gates was still a teenager, bright, intense, and increasingly consumed by the mysteries of computing. He spent hours in front of screens, analyzing errors, rewriting code, pushing machines until they crashed, then pushing them again. But for all his passion, the world around him had not yet caught up. Computers were still rare, still massive, still far too costly for most people to touch, let alone own. Gates could feel something coming, but he didn't know when opportunity would open its door. Then in January 1975, it happened. Paul Allen walked into a small store in Seattle, holding a magazine that would change both of their lives. On the cover of Popular Electronics was a blue box with switches and blinking lights. The Altair 8800, a brand new microcomputer kit that anyone could purchase and build at home. For Gates and Allen, it might as well have been a message from the future. This machine wasn't just another piece of hardware. It was a spark, the first sign that computing might break out of corporate labs and enter the hands of ordinary people. The very revolution Gates had quietly imagined was no longer abstract. It was real. It had a name, and it was ready. But there was a problem. The Altair didn't have a programming language. It needed software, badly. Without it, the computer was little more than a metal box that blinked. And that's when a bold idea formed. Bill and Paul decided to call METS, the company behind the Altair, and tell them they had created a working version of BASIC for the new computer. It was a daring move, because they hadn't written a single line of it yet. On the phone, Gates spoke with confidence, outlining their existing software. The company was intrigued. They wanted a demonstration, and just like that, a door opened, even though the program itself still lived only in Gates's imagination. From that moment, they worked nonstop. Gates coded with relentless focus, writing a full BASIC interpreter in weeks, something that would normally require months. Paul handled testing and optimization. Neither of them slept much. Neither of them talked about anything else. Their future depended entirely on making this work. When the software was complete, Paul Allen flew from Seattle to Albuquerque carrying a roll of paper with their program punched into it. If the demo failed, everything would collapse in an instant. He walked into the METS office surrounded by unfamiliar faces, unfamiliar machines, and a future that felt uncertain. The Altair sat on a table, humming softly. Paul loaded their code. The room waited. And then it ran. Perfectly. For the first time, the Altair 8800 responded to commands written by two young programmers from Seattle. And in that moment, something shifted in the tech world. The machine worked. The company was impressed. And Bill Gates and Paul Allen were offered a deal. They now had a path, a direction, a foothold in an industry that was just being born. This was more than a breakthrough. It was the beginning of something they would soon name Microsoft. But the real challenge was still ahead. Because to build a company, Gates would have to make a decision that would change not only his life, but the future of computing itself. The turning point. Microsoft is born by the mid-1970s. Bill Gates was balancing two worlds. On one side, he was a Harvard student, attending classes, living in a dorm, following a path many expected him to take. On the other side, he was writing code with Paul Allen at every spare moment they could find. Harvard offered stability, but the world outside was shifting faster than anyone realized. Then came the moment that changed everything. In early 1975, the Altair 8800, the small machine that had captured their imagination, was beginning to attract attention across the country. Hobbyists wanted it. Engineers wanted it. Tech magazines couldn't stop writing about it. But there was still one unsolved problem. The Altair had no standard software. No system that made it easy to use. Nothing that could unlock its true potential. Bill and Paul had just delivered their version of BASIC to MS. It worked. And that single achievement placed both of them at the center of a new industry that didn't yet have a name. But after that first success, there was a bigger conversation, one that neither of them could ignore. Paul Allen believed they were standing at a crossroads. Computers were shrinking in size, microprocessors were getting cheaper, and a new generation of machines, not just for corporations, but for ordinary people, was coming. He told Gates plainly, if we don't start a company now, someone else will shape the future instead of us. It wasn't a dramatic speech, just a clear, urgent truth. Gates understood the risk. Leaving Harvard wasn't just unusual. It meant letting go of a path his family trusted. But he also knew that opportunities like this didn't wait for anyone. The next few weeks were filled with late-night discussions, long walks across the Harvard campus, and calculations scribbled on notebook paper. Gates analyzed everything: the market, the technology, their competitors, the pace of change. He wasn't impulsive. He rarely made a move without thinking 10 steps ahead. But every path led to the same decision. In the spring of 1975, Gates called his parents. He told them he was taking a leave of absence from Harvard, not dropping out, not yet, but stepping away long enough to try something bold with Paul Allen. A name for the company had already been chosen, a combination of microcomputer and software. Microsoft. They filed the paperwork in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the city where MITES was headquartered. Two young men, barely out of school, sharing a small apartment and working from a room filled with cables, terminals, and piles of printouts. No employees, no grand office, just determination, a few contracts, and a belief that software would one day be as valuable as the machines themselves. Microsoft's earliest days were nothing glamorous. Gates spent hours writing code, debugging, and chasing down clients who still weren't convinced that software should be paid for. Allen handled hardware tests and negotiations with MITES. They worked 7 days a week, often through the night. But for the first time, the world began to notice that two young programmers, one 19, the other 22, had stepped onto a path that no one else had the courage to take. Because while most companies focused on selling hardware, Gates made a different choice. He wanted to own the software that controlled the machines, not just build it once, but license it again and again. That decision would later transform Microsoft into one of the most influential companies in history. But in those early days, nothing was guaranteed. Their contracts were small, their resources were limited, and every week presented a new challenge they hadn't faced before. Yet something was undeniable. A company had been born, a vision had been set, and Bill Gates was no longer just a student with talent. He was now the co-founder of a business poised to shape the digital revolution. The rise. Microsoft gains power. By the late 1970s, the small apartment in Albuquerque had transformed into the heartbeat of a company on the rise. Microsoft was no longer just a name on paper. It was a growing enterprise driven by relentless work and a bold vision. Gates, barely out of his teens, immersed himself in every detail of the company. He wrote code, debugged programs, negotiated contracts, and mapped out long-term strategy. He understood one critical truth. Software could outlast hardware, A computer might become obsolete, but the code running on it could be reused, updated, and licensed again and again. At the same time, Paul Allen maintained crucial relationships with hardware companies. Together, they secured early clients who understood the value of a software-driven machine, companies that would otherwise have overlooked a small startup run by two young men from Seattle. Then came the opportunity that would define Microsoft's early trajectory. IBM. In 1980, IBM, the largest computer company in the world, approached Microsoft to provide an operating system for their first personal computer. IBM expected a straightforward transaction, software as a product. But Gates saw a much larger opportunity. Instead of selling the software outright, he proposed a licensing deal, retaining ownership of the operating system. For a company like IBM, this was unusual. But Gates's vision was clear. Control the software, and you control the future. Meanwhile, Microsoft's internal growth was relentless. The company's small team was expanding, and employees worked long, intense hours. Gates demanded precision, attention to detail, and dedication. Mistakes were expensive, but learning fast was essential. The early MS-DOS project was completed under intense pressure. Gates's combination of technical skill and strategic foresight meant that Microsoft not only delivered what IBM needed, but secured a position that would lead to exponential growth. By the early 1980s, Microsoft was no longer a small startup in Albuquerque. The company had relocated to Redmond, Washington, moving into a proper office with dedicated development labs, clerical staff, and a growing sales team. Gates, now in his late 20s, was becoming a household name in tech circles. And yet, the real story of their rise wasn't just in numbers. It was in mindset. Gates had built a company that anticipated the future, before the market fully understood it. He had positioned Microsoft to ride the wave of personal computing, licensing software instead of selling it once, and ensuring the company's growth would compound in ways that few competitors could match. By 1985, Microsoft released Windows 1.0, their first graphical user interface, a move that would revolutionize personal computing and cement Gates's reputation as a visionary. From a small apartment to controlling the software that would run millions of computers worldwide, the rise of Microsoft had begun in earnest. The billion-dollar moment by the mid-1980s, Microsoft had grown from a small startup in Albuquerque to a software powerhouse in Redmond, Washington. Gates, now in his early 30s, had become a figure known across the industry for both his brilliance and his intensity. Everything came to a head in 1986, the year Microsoft went public. The IPO wasn't just a milestone, it was the world finally catching up to the vision Gates had pursued since the days of the Lakeside Teletype Terminal. On the morning of the IPO, investors crowded the trading floor of the Nasdaq. Microsoft's stock opened at $21 per share. By the end of the first day, the price had more than doubled. In a single day, Bill Gates became one of the youngest self-made billionaires in history. For Gates, the wealth was not just numbers on a screen. It was proof that his strategy, licensing software instead of selling it outright, focusing relentlessly on quality and market foresight, had paid off. It validated every late night, every risk, every decision he had made to leave Harvard, to bet on software over hardware, to challenge the norms of the industry. But the moment wasn't simply financial, it was cultural. Gates's success signaled a shift in the tech world. Young, intelligent programmers could now shape industries, economies, and society itself. Microsoft's dominance grew rapidly. Companies around the world adopted MS-DOS as the standard for personal computing. Gates's foresight meant that software became an indispensable part of business, education, and home life. And yet, even amid this meteoric rise, Gates remained focused. While the world saw wealth, headlines, and power, he continued writing code, planning products, and building a company that he believed could continue to define the digital era. Hidden lessons. The story of Bill Gates isn't just about coding, wealth, or even Microsoft. It's about choices, vision, and relentless focus. Lesson 1. Obsession meets opportunity. From the Lakeside School Computer Lab to the Altair Basic Project, Gates recognized that deep curiosity combined with decisive action could create enormous leverage. Opportunities don't always announce themselves. Sometimes you must see the potential that others cannot. Lesson 2. Think long-term, act decisively. When IBM approached Microsoft in 1980, Gates could have sold the software outright. Instead, he chose to license it, ensuring long-term control and revenue. Many would have played it safe. Gates chose vision. That single decision transformed Microsoft into a global leader. Lesson 3. Embrace calculated risks. Leaving Harvard to focus on a startup was unconventional, even risky. But Gates understood that temporary discomfort was nothing compared to the potential payoff. He didn't gamble blindly. He calculated, planned, and executed. Lesson 4. Relentless attention to detail. Whether debugging code or negotiating contracts, Gates maintained rigorous standards. He understood that the small things, consistency, quality, and precision, compound over time into enormous advantage. Lesson 5. Adapt and anticipate. Gates's early focus on software licensing shows a mind constantly thinking ahead. He didn't just react to the computer revolution, he anticipated it. This forward-looking perspective allowed him to shape the future rather than simply follow it. And finally, persistence and resilience. From being banned from Lakeside's computer lab to facing skeptical clients and competitors, Gates never let temporary setbacks dictate his path. He kept learning, iterating, and moving forward. Together, these lessons explain why Gates's story is more than wealth. It's a blueprint for vision, strategy, and action. A reminder that success often comes from seeing the unseen, acting when others hesitate, and never losing focus on the long game. Like and subscribe for more billionaire stories